latest football scores, morning paper, Morning Star. Paper, mister?
Newspaper publishing continued. Today we'll talk about newspaper costing and other aspects. First of all, it's inexpensive to buy, right? So newspapers aren't expensive because they are printed in bulk, they're printed on cheap sheets of paper, and they are also published quite frequently. So it's not an expensive product, if you view it as a product per se, as opposed to a beautiful coffee table book or a novel. There are some newspapers that are available for free, like the Record. I don't know if you're familiar with that paper. How that usually works is that they make up their money just from ad sales, and that's how they can actually afford to distribute papers for free. Right, so it's inexpensive to buy. What usually happens is you have your printed formats and you have your electronic formats now with the digital age and the digital revolution over the last few decades. What happens there as well is that you'll sometimes have free content available online, and then you'll have a paywall. Now, a paywall is basically you're only allowed access to specific content once you've paid a subscription fee, and your subscribers would then get access to that information. I know News24 does that as well. It's quite irritating, but I understand why they need to do it. Like, you start reading an article and then they say, oh, sorry, you need to subscribe to actually get access to this information. So that's what they refer to. That is what's referred to as a paywall. But a lot of these times, electronically, newspapers would then do both. They'll have some information, they will publish information that is freely available, and then they'll have another option, whereas if you want to read more, you have to pay a certain fee. So a combination is always a good way of doing it, as opposed to the traditional way where you buy the paper, you read it, and then that's that. The other factor that we need to consider is, although that it's inexpensive for a consumer, it's very expensive actually to produce, because it's quite labor and resource intensive, and the turnaround time of it is also absolutely crazy if you think the short shelf time that it actually has, because every single time there's a new paper coming out. But the time that people need to put in to work on the news, to get it ready, to have it printed, to have those absolute huge amounts of large print runs of paper that needs to be newspapers that needs to be printed. So it is quite labor intensive and very costly. Right.
It's just after 11 p.m. on a Friday night, and in about 8 hours' time, you're going to be opening your weekend paper. But for now, this is what it looks like. We're at Transcontinental Printing in Vaughan, Ontario, to see the Globe and Mail go to press.
I always tell all the folks that work for me, there's only two instant ways to get fired: run out of paper and run out of ink. Plate's aluminum. There's a coating on there so that the image can burn onto the plate. And so what this image is this image allows ink to adhere to where you see an image, and then that image is then offset back onto the paper when the paper runs through the unit. The pumps, which are behind these, pump the ink from here through those pipes out to the presses and down to the presses. Because we run a hybrid product here, which is running both cold set and heat set, we have to have two separate sets of ink. The heat set ink is actually a different type of ink that doesn't actually soak into the paper. It sits on top of the paper, and when it runs through the oven on the press, it solidifies the ink, whereas cold set ink actually soaks into the paper. And it's even more complicated because the heat set ink is actually run on a heavier stock. So if you look, the paper's even different.
So it's a complicated process, but worth it, right?
Absolutely.
The first thing you notice when you walk in is the smell. It is overwhelming and powerful, and it's like a mixture of paper and hardware store smell is the only way that I can describe it. It's also very loud, which is why I'm wearing these.
So this is we call the quiet room because it's relatively quiet compared to what it's like out there. But this is where the press operators actually run the press. When they're outside, all they're really doing is webbing up the press and hanging plates. Once that's completed, Then they come in here and they run the show from inside the quiet room.
How many times a night would you say generally you have to stop the presses to make a fix or change?
Well, they'll have at least one plate change, scheduled plate change every night.
What does that mean when you have a scheduled plate change?
They know that we have to get the press started and get the papers put out the door to reach the further distance that the trucks have to go. But by doing that, they'll actually have to start without having some of the latest sports scores and such. So when the sports games are over, whether it's baseball, football, hockey, they'll stop the press, we'll replate those pages, and then we'll get back up and running. Depending on what news is taking place or what sports are going on, there could actually be 2 stops. Minutes do make a lot of difference. Just keep in mind the last file comes at 11 o'clock, but we still have to generate the plate, and then the plate has to come and hang on the press, and then the press has to start up and get good copy, and the good copy has to go out to post-press, and they have to insert it into the machines out there and create the bundles down the conveyor and into the back of the truck. So there's where your 45-minute window is, from last file to first paper out.
All right, then our newspaper strategies. What are the kind of strategies that a newspaper can use in order to, differentiate itself? Because there are so many newspapers out there. How do you know which one to choose from a consumer side, from a business perspective, being a newspaper publisher? What will make you different? So you can use to do product differentiation and audience differentiation, either or both. Now, audience differentiation means that you are targeting your specific newspaper at a specific target audience. It may be more a mature audience, or may it be something that you're trying to target a younger audience. So demographics can really help you to target your readers. Will it be a more cheap kind of entry-level newspaper, so you're targeting a different demographic of a different income class? Or do you want to target, your working or middle class or high income group, and therefore your paper is also priced a little bit higher, and the tone of the paper, the information that it includes, etc., is different. So demographics relate to age, to race, to income, to education level, language, etc. Okay, so the place of use. The place of use, basically, that refers to, are you using this paper at home? Are you using this paper while commuting? Is it something that people get on the trains, especially overseas? So you get the newsstands there because you will be commuting between Pretoria and Sandton, for example, and you'll be reading the paper in the Gautrain, or on the Gautrain, or in a bus, or wherever. So you need to think about your audience differentiation. Are you doing it for commuters? Are you doing it for business people who are sitting in the lounge at the airports? Or are you doing it for people sitting at a doctor's office and they have more time? Or is it available at libraries where people can scan through all the newspapers of the day and sit and read it? What is the place of use? Or is it, as I always use my dad as an example, he likes to get the paper on Sundays, sit in his lazy boy and then just read the paper while having a drink, listening to music, and waiting for a nice big lunch to be served. So that is in the comfort of your own home. The sales method can also be an audience differentiator. So is it that you are trying to attract more subscribers? So you basically distribute this paper to your audience via subscription base? Or is it a single copy, so people will just get it and buy it off the shelf, or, as I say, while they're commuting, or they're waiting, or they find this interesting, or they're a student and they need to buy a newspaper in order to do some research? Or you can obviously always do a combination of different methods for the audience differentiation. Product differentiation, this refers more to the distribution time. Is it a daily? Is it a weekly? Is it a monthly? When you guys did your prac for newspapers, you noticed that there were specific questions related to weekly magazines, daily magazine, not magazines, my newspapers, and you just have to think about the frequency. So some people love getting a newspaper every single day because they know that this is the newest news and current, whereas other people like to maybe get a weekly one where they can catch up on the whole week's news, or a monthly, or is it only a weekend kind of newspaper? Those also exist. The editorial orientation, is it focusing on international news, or is it only local? I mentioned the previous example of the Record, which is also regional based. So they will, for example, have a Pretoria East edition, they'll have a Pretoria North edition. So what is their editorial orientation, or is it a mixture of all? They have international as well as local news, or is it geographically specific? Their news focus, is it more business oriented like the Wall Street Journal or the Financial Times, or is it a New York Times? Just to give you a few examples. Or is it focused more on general news? Is it focused more on entertainment, etc.? The presentation and tone then links to that, because obviously if your news focus is more business oriented, your presentation and your tone will also be more serious, sophisticated, financially orientated, the jargon and the kind of words that you use. Whereas if your presentation tone is more sensational, like you have a tabloid magazine talking about the celebrities and who is, divorcing whom, and who is losing a child in a custody battle, and this one has cellulite and this one has that, the kind of thing. So your presentation and your tone can also be a differentiating factor. Reading levels. This ties in with your audience. Are you doing something for second or third English language speakers? So your language and reading level will be different. Even the way the newspaper is laid out, the amount of information that it includes. Yes. Your graphics and photos. Are you a newspaper that includes a lot of huge, beautiful photos that are very, eye-catching, attention-grabbing, or are you more focused on text and have less graphics and images? That also can be a differentiating factors. Also, the graphics, photos, there you can also include things like the cartoons, or the jokes, or, little series of little serialized stories as well that you can read in newspapers. Yes, those are all elements that you can add to differentiate your specific newspaper from any other one. And then your production choice. What is the kind of ink that you use, the paper you use, the size that you use? Most newspapers are in specific size, but if you compare it, for example, to the Rapport, as opposed to the Record, there is definitely a different size. All of these publishing agencies or newspapers usually look at what is the most cost-effective way to produce a quality paper. But, that depends on the kind of ink that's used, the kind of printing that's used. Usually it will still be lithographic printing, and you saw the video now with how the printing works as well. Okay. So, getting to the South African newspapers now. So that now that we have an overview of, how newspapers are organized, the elements they contain. South African newspapers, our top-selling South African newspapers currently, based on an article from Mark Lives. This is basically the Sunday Times. This was taken from the AMPS data. It's the Sunday Times here on the right-hand side. The Soccer Laduma, Daily Sun, Rapport, Isolezwe, and The Star. Those are the top 6 ones, and you can see the figures there as well, which is quite interesting. Wish our book sales would have looked like this. Carrying on, you'll have your Sowetan, Isolezwe Ngusontu, the next one, which I can't pronounce, I'm sorry, and then Dison. All right. Here you'll see Soccer Laduma here at the bottom. You also have to think about this, why these are the top-selling newspapers. Remember, we'll get to the stats still later, but it's interesting, not in this module specifically, but I mean, if you see what our population is made out of in terms of race, of class, of income, of education level. So if you look at these things, you'll definitely see where the buying power lies. And a lot of people who wouldn't necessarily read, books, would definitely consume newspapers. Newspapers is one of the newspapers are actually the biggest information medium that is consumed. Look here on the right hand side with the Daily Sun as well. You see once again the ad. Boxer Black Friday, etc., etc. So that's a really cool spot to have a advertisement. But I can also see the church and state division there, because people want to obviously have more information on the editorial component than the advertising component, which here it looks like 50-50, right?